I august 2019 ble det annonsert at Aleksandar Hemon, suksessforfatteren som i 1995 flyttet fra et krigsherjet Sarajevo og gjorde amerikaner av seg, hadde skrevet manus til den fjerde Matrix-filmen, som skulle starte produksjonen i 2020. Det er uvisst hva koronapandemien får å si for innspillingen, men det som er sikkert er at den aktuelle globale situasjonen kjennes som en beretning beslektet med scifi-klassikeren fra tidlig 2000-tall. Det er kanskje til denne sjangeren vi må for å finne analogier for hvor vi står i dag, politisk, mentalt og fysisk. Kanskje er litteraturen dit vi skal for å helbrede innsiden og utsiden. Redaktør, forfatter og journalist John Freeman skisserte også i sin bok Dictionary of Undoing strategier for å overleve i vår samtidig politiske klima. Som resultat av koronapandemien holder amerikanere seg stort sett hjemme denne våren. John Freeman har møtt Aleksandar Hemon digitalt, og vi får være med.
Hi, this is John Freeman coming to you from New York City. It's a great pleasure to be here with my friend Aleksandar Hemon, who's coming to you from Princeton, New Jersey.
Oh.
Hello, Sasha.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm sorry I just outed you from the witness protection program.
I'm here hiding from bad guys.
I'm very pleased to be here because we're going to be talking a little bit over the next half hour about Sasha's new book, or two new books called My Parents, An Introduction, and This Does Not Belong to You, which is a series of...
And also your book, The Park, your new book. And there's another new book, Dictionary of the Undoing. I got some questions.
I've got a lot of questions for you, but I think I'd like to start in a nearer term. The last time, or one of the last times we were together in an event like this was in Paris in 2017 with Nathan Englander and ZZ Packer. And we had a discussion about what would happen in the next 3 years with the election of Donald Trump to the presidency of the US. And you made a series of then startling predictions about what would unfold over the next couple of years, including white nationalist or paramilitary-like attacks, a kind of breakdown of some degree of civil order, a series of tests of the norms of the US political system, and ultimately you predicted some kind of pandemic or national disaster that would enhance the opportunity to go further with what you were thinking would be a series of attacks on the civil justice system. And by and large, every single one of your predictions has come true, including one which was a kind of breakdown of the United States into a series of regional networks of states, which is already happening under COVID-19 with a series of states buying PPE together. Do you want to say what it feels like to have been right? Or do you want to make some new predictions while we're here?
Well, it's horrible to be right. I didn't think of those as predictions. I don't think of them now. They are reasonable fears if such thing exists, right? Based on, I guess, a certain amount of my personal and historical experience and the logic of nationalism, which is this strange ideology that claims to be unique and individual for each nation or country, right? But it has the same pathologies across the board. And so, because I lived through the breakup of Yugoslavia and, several, as we were, nationalist movements rising simultaneously, I can spot the symptoms, right? Not as a scholar, not as an analyst, not as a predictor, but rather as someone who possesses that experience. And so the logic of nationalism has led us to this point in the United States. There are many symptoms. It is all in conditions for that to be possible. One of them is a weak state, if you wish. And the United States has been a weak state in many ways for quite a while now, right? Despite all the propaganda and the fantasies of American greatness and the mythologies of the American Constitution and all that. And so that is visible to me, it has been in this country for a while. I'm not happy that it's visible to me. There's a certain comfort in oblivion, right? Which many, many Americans enjoy and have enjoyed historically. But I don't have the comfort. But it feels horrible to be right about this, or at least not even be right. It's not a question of right or wrong. That my fears have been right, that I was right to fear what was to come.
Your new book is a series of memoirs. In one half of the book, it's a rather straightforward series of narrative essays about your family, your parents, following them from birth and telling us a little bit about the family that brought them to be, and carrying them from Bosnia, where you grew up, to Canada, where they emigrated after, or just prior to the siege of Sarajevo. And the second half of the book is a series of shard-like prose pieces, sometimes like poems, of memories growing up until about the age of 10 or 11 or 12. And those two books interact in interesting ways. You talked just now about nationalism as a kind of pathology, but those two books interact in a way that suggests to me that there is some form of collective memory that is not necessarily nationalistic, that is important to groups of people, including, say, a family. And I wonder if you can speak about the ways that collective memory and personal memory interact, maybe even within your own family.
Yes, well, there's a great book by the late Svetlana Boyne, who used to teach at Harvard, called The Future of Nostalgia, where she breaks down the operations of nostalgia. 1/3 of the book is about Nabokov and his work, because he's the bard of nostalgia in many ways, or anti-nostalgia at the same time. And so she makes a distinction between reflective memory and restorative memory. And restorative memory is something that nations or national projects or movements or people in power practice, right? They imagine that there was a past when the country was great, the great America, right? And then the project, it's a symptom of nationalist movements. Their project is to restore this presumed lost past, right? But the whole project, it's of course a fantasy. In many ways, it requires violence over the real lives of people, right? The people who do not fit the fantasies, racially, ethnically, or just ideologically, they have to be erased, hence genocide. But it is contingent upon the proposition that that past could somehow be restored or retrieved or rebuilt, make America great again, right? And reflective memory, however, is individualized. It is a matter of displacement. And whoever engages with reflective memory, people like me or my family or Nabokov or any number of people who are displaced, they know that it is gone. So it could be only reflected upon. And it's never a whole discourse, as it were. It's not a solid unit. There's no project behind it. One can recall moments, situations, days at most, experiences, and sometimes they cannot even be temporarily located. That is, you don't know when it happened. You only know that it happened. And so it is, in a good way, I would think, it's anti-historical. It's hard to falsify it into consistent discourse that could turn into an ideology. And so temperamentally and experientially, I'm inclined toward reflective memory, but also ideologically, right? I want to preserve, as a writer, I think that's one of the things that literature does. And it might be the best thing for doing that. It is containing all these evanescent experiences, individual displaced memories. There's no place for such things other than language, really. And so that's what you do in your poetry, right? I mean, this is why I feel such an affinity for your work in many ways, because that can be caught and kept and also transformed and thereby lost again in some ways, right? So the experience that is written up in a book 20 years later or 30 years later in a foreign language is not the experience I remember. It is a transformed experience. It both erases and contains the memory, or the experience that triggers the memory. And that's that means, and this is also what Stefan Born talks about, a kind of duality, that you are both who you used to be and not, that you both are trying to preserve the memory but destroy it as well. This is not what nationalists do. They present everything as real, whereas we dabble in evanescent things.
Yeah, I'm very drawn to parks as a kind of experiential sieve, you know, because even if a park is full of monuments, say, as the Luxembourg Gardens is, the park which the park is based upon, even if it's full of monuments that speak to a kind of idealized nationalist past, the park is also much more full of natural life forms, trees, air, water, sky, that are calling you out to be your multiple selves, you know, because they all those elements, whether we like it or not, and inspire reflection. And I was choosing the park as a kind of locus of that book, because I think we need far more elements in our lives that inspire those gateways to other selves. You know, Elif Shafak, who was at the Norse Literature Festival last summer in Lillehammer, speaks about this quite a bit, as how nationalist projects are deeply resistant to people with multiple selves, whether it's a transnational identity or trans identity, gender-wise. They want people to be reducible actors. And in reading your book, My Parents: An Introduction, and This Does Not Belong to You, I was very struck by how you divided the memoir of your parents into sections based on food and music and elements which can be nationalized and turned into anthems, and yet you reduce them to individualized experience and show how they bring meaning to your parents in a way that resists definition. Even if they were using those things for definitionally historical purposes, as with music, and your dad loves to sing Ukrainian folk songs, even if the past he's writing about is not that A, tangible, and B, relevant to historical past. And I guess I want to ask you if it's possible to be a contradiction, if you will, to be someone who longs for an idealized past, but whose gestures, reality, and specific sort of texture of day-to-day existence refutes that thing, you know, because it seems like in your portrait of your parents, your father would love to be more Ukrainian if he could. But in fact,
he doesn't know what it would entail, really, in some ways. But yes. I think that's a very interesting question. And it is also, I was rereading The Park in preparation for this conversation, and it bears out, it rewards rereading. But one of the things that I thought of, and you just brought up, is that the collectivity that is assembled in the park, right? And I think you in your poems, you often use we. And to me, my first reaction when someone in speaking or writing says we, I always, this is one of my knee-jerk reactions, is who is this? Who is this we? How is it self-evident? How is it defined, right? The nationalists find we to be self-evident, right? We find these truths to be self-evident, and that's it. Whereas a park, for instance, it is an assembled collectivity, right? Temporal and evanescent, again. People go through, they get out, right? People share experience, but they're not essentially connected to that experience. The claim of nationalists is that there's a transcendental essence of the nation that is presumably inside every member of the nation. And if it's not, it is their fault because they lost it somehow, by being negligent, by being homosexuals, by being whatever the nationalists don't approve of. And so a place like Park does not create a lasting community. This can sound like a bad thing, but actually it's a good thing, because people, when they enter it, they have to renegotiate their relations, accept certain set of rules. That is, do not destroy the park, for instance, do not piss in the fountain. And they also have to engage with each other in terms that are negotiated on the spot, as it were. And the important aspect of that is simple randomness. That is, you walk in the park, you do not know who's going to be there. And that's what parks also, importantly, they happen in the cities. They exist in cities, by and large, right? And cities are fundamentally defined by the randomness of encounters, right? Which is in the history of nationalist ideologies, what you can always find is hatred toward the cities, including America now. Even if Trump is from New York, there's this, propaganda against cities as the hubs of immorality and liberalism and so on. And so the collectivity that is assembled in the park, it is temporal and it is based on affinities, right? Not on essences and transcendences. I think that is the way that literature works in many ways, or at least can work, because you do have nationalist literature, which is presumably engaging and reproducing and establishing the national essence. This is much of 19th century European literature, for sure, and not just European. It's just blatantly and readably nationalist.
Can you talk about objects and agency in the context of nationalism and memory, as we've been speaking of it, and what that means for your parents and what it means for you? You've just moved from Chicago to Princeton.
Well, it's 2 years, but yes, it feels like I just did. Yes, I think people have been talking. I mean, migration is a fundamental fact of this world in this century, the past century, in many centuries. Certainly in the second half of the 20th century, in the beginning of this millennium, the world is marked by major migratory movements. And so I was part of it. My family is part of it. I have family all over the world, in Sweden and in Italy and in Brussels and in Australia and played in Bosnia and former Yugoslavia and so on. And so I've been thinking about it a lot and writing. And to my mind, the logic of migration is very simple. People, and I think it's even biologically determined to some extent, as it were, it's an evolutionary quality of humanity. People move toward the space where they think or feel or hope they will have greater agency. They move away from spaces where they don't have agency, and war deprives you of agency unless you're shooting someone in the head, and where people could be killed. And then move into spaces where they could make decisions about their lives, or so they think, and help their children eat and save lives of people they love and live there, right? This is why when I look at the boats that cross the Mediterranean and people, trying to cross borders while being pushed away, I don't see masses of zombies as they're represented in media and Western media. I see people who are trying to get somewhere where they could increase the amount of dignity in their life and work for a living and so on. And this bears out whatever the form of migration is. My parents had it relatively easy. They did not have to get on a boat. They did not have to crawl, swim across the river at night. They took a plane to Toronto and landed, and there was a representative Canadian government who helped them and helped them find an apartment. And they had a social worker and took English classes. With all that, their sense of their previous life and the world was that they lost everything, right? But they found ways to establish a zone or space where they can exercise their agency, the human agency, where they can have a sense that they have some control over their life. And they're very fond of Canada, and they do not think that they think that Canada is kind to them. But their backyard, their small piece of land and the house, this is the domain of the agency. This is where they make stuff, right? This is where where my father built a smokehouse and had his bees and has his workshop. This is where my mother and he keep a garden. They fight raccoons and birds and rabbits, and they constantly engage with the world, this little piece of world, where they can change outcomes in a very simple way. And so in the middle of the pandemic, right, they don't really go anywhere. They're in the 80s. Whenever I call them, they're doing something in their backyard, right? They're not sitting and despairing in their house. Because tomatoes growing, there's no way around that. The bees, they cannot be abandoned. By the way, today's the International Bee Day. And so we celebrated in my family. and so they exercise this agency, and their engagement with the world is located there. And that is They wake up in the morning, they have projects. All of the projects are executed and done in their backyard, in their house. There's not a space. My projects, your projects, we're all over the place. Let's go to Norway now. They do it in their backyard. But in many ways, in some ways, I envy them, sort of that is so reliably available to them at this time, at least, for as long as they're healthy.
Has your workshop of your own changed to any degree? You know, when Question of Bruno came out, I think one of the most striking things about your work was the highly textured English language prose style, which was often compared to Nabokov for the length, I think, to some degree, of your commitment to imagery, the unlikeliness of sort of pairings of words. But as you've progressed as a writer in the last 20 years, I feel like one thing I've seen, and you can refute me in this, but is a movement towards complexity in narrative design, in that your forms of resistance to narratives which lack complexity, such as nationalism, such as any kind of treatment of migration or immigrants as less than human, has been to tell stories of narrative complexity about people who are migrants, or about people like the former self that you describe in This Does Not Belong to You, who are almost pre-nationalistic, because you're 10 years old. Is that a fair assessment of your work? Because, the Dictionary of the Undoing, the book that I published last year, was in some ways prompted by a discussion with you at an airport where you sort of challenged me to say, what do you actually believe in? And I began to look at and bear down on words that I thought were kind of broken or mangled or still full of hope, if not hope, then possibility, as lamps within the language field of the English language. Whereas it feels like your response to the latest couple of years of crisis has been to push into narrative harder. And I wonder if you can talk about that.
I can. I was thinking about Dictionary of the Undoing, and I remembered that day in the airport where we talked about that. And also in relation to what I was mentioning earlier, the way you use we, and the fact that I cannot do that. And this is not, obviously, I'm glad that you are doing it, right? I cannot do it. And I appreciate your willingness to engage in a utopian project of defining this we as against the undoing, right? As against the American nationalism at its worst. And so you're already working in language on constituting this community that is perhaps as temporary as a community in a park, right? But necessary, just as being in the park is to think, or the park of the world, to think about it. And so I'm very cautious, or at least wary of the word we being used, but I trust you fully in using it, because I know you, and know where you're coming from, but also I know your work, and this comes through in Dictionary of the Undoing. And one of the reasons, or perhaps the main reason why I can't use the word we, is I think of people as individual, and I don't mean the sort of libertarian American individualistic bullshit, but rather that each life is infinitely complex, right? There's vast amounts of overlapping of experience between individuals, right? Even if they don't live in the same country, starting with the biology, right? We live, we die, we love, we don't love, we are hungry, we want to go into a place where we have greater agency, but also just being in the world at the same time, right? Which is history. We share a lot of that. But what is unique and irreplaceable and not reproducible in any way is the combination of all these millions of elements, from the memories that no one. The reason why I wrote This Doesn't Belong to You, I realized I am the only one who remembers many of this, and if I forget them, they're gone. If I die, they're gone, right? So what do I do with this? Just let it go? If I were involved in a nationalist project of retrieving some kind of fantasy transcendence, that none of that would be important, because I would contain a national essence, and that's all that matters. But to me, to keep those alive, or at least available, right, for thinking about. They're not reproductions of what happened. Rather, they are memories of stories of stories. It is, I think it's a crucial project of my literature, at least. That also means that the more I live, there's more stuff like that, right? And life becomes more complex just by virtue of living in this history at this time. And so to me, I've been striving toward complexity in all the things that I've been doing. I mean, I write across forms and genres. It's a little obsessive. And so the novel that I'm working on now has a lot of things happen, but an aspect of the complexity is also multilinguality, right? So I found myself at the same time, and it's part of it comes from the same urge to, put in events, things happening, right? And languages. And then increase the complexity on the narrative level, but also on the language level. I do not anticipate high sales for this project because I don't know who the ideal reader is. The simple transaction of nationalist, or at least national literature, right, is that here I am talking in a language that everyone here speaks about things that everyone knows. And so, I can talk in a complex manner about that, but the framework is defined and self-evident, very important. Mm-hmm. But the book that I'm writing, I can't even remember the number of languages I have deployed so far, right? But in the first chapter, there are 5, 3 of which I don't speak. I can't even read my work. It's not entirely available to me, and because I've written the first chapter so long ago, I forgot what some of those German, for instance. I forgot what some of those German sentences mean. I'm going to have to translate myself to myself. Now, this is a little crazy, but at the same time, it's part of this drive that you mentioned toward complexity, right? What mind? I'm interested in minds, or consciousnesses rather, that contain this complexity. That is not always seldom in fact, a happy experience, right? It's constantly parts of your consciousness are tearing at each other. They're mutually challenging, to say the least, if not to say the least, I'm sorry. If not totally mutually destructive. But it is where I want to go. And I don't know whether it's going to end. And so the kind of literature that challenges me is something that I don't know how to write yet. I have to write it to see what it looks like. I love the quote, and I know we talked about it. Gary Winogrand, the great American photographer, who said, "I photograph things to see what things look like photographed." And to me, that is, I write a novel to see what that novel is. And I don't know yet, but I'm moving in that direction.
Well, on that note, Sasha Hemon, it's been a pleasure. It seems unimaginable that I will see you again, but I'm hoping that literature, if not, the mind can imagine a world in which we can take a coffee again and be together, if not in Norway, and somewhere between here and Princeton.
I imagine it will happen. You'll be well in the meantime, and thank you. Always a pleasure talking to you. Yeah. And everyone else.
En av fordelene med å være forfatter at arbeidet kan gjøres hjemmefra og i lockdown. Takket være samarbeidet vårt med Brooklyn Book Festival fikk vi ført sammen Aleksandar Hemon og John Freeman til denne samtalen fra USA.